All right, so question from the services, and this is a question that comes up from time to time about the issue of anger. What happens when you've had a situation where someone has really offended you? They have really done something that not only violates you, but clearly is a violation of God's own character, and you're very angry about it. And in fact, it's something that the person wrote in the question, God himself would be very angry about this injustice. What do we do with that anger? And I think it's always best to begin with the picture of what we know about God and anger, and what we know about ourselves in that portrait about God and anger when it comes to sin. And one of the best examples I can think of is to go back to King David himself. You remember that King David is guilty, even though he's the king of Israel and very close to God. He has a moment that is a real tragedy where, in the midst of a moment of weakness, he commits adultery with Bathsheba, but then he compounds it by having her husband killed. So he commits murder and adultery, and then he takes Bathsheba into the palace. They have a baby, all these kinds of things. And so, in the middle of that, God sends Nathan the prophet to the palace to confront David. But Nathan, instead of confronting him directly, tells David a parable, a story of a man who is very wealthy, has lots of sheep, has a traveler come into town. There's a neighbor of this wealthy man who's a poor man who has a single sheep that is like a family pet. And instead of using one of his own sheep from his flock, instead he breaks into the other man's house or the neighbor's property and steals the other sheep, slays the lamb, serves it up as dinner. And Nathan tells the story to David, and David, as the king of Israel, is incensed. In his anger, he declares, surely this man should be punished. Surely this man should die, is David's statement. And in that moment, what God allows David to do is to fill the anger of the injustice God feels toward David's behavior of the murder and adultery with Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite. And so we know that God feels anger about human sin, and he let David feel the weight of the anger God felt about David's own betrayal. And so it is true that God does get angry about injustice. And David, though, pleads with God in that moment. You remember that Psalm 51, along with some other Psalms, where David says, be gracious to me, O God, according to the richness of your mercy. Blot out my iniquities. And so David pleads with God's mercy that God's anger would subside over this great injustice. When it comes to us, and we see that there are times when even angry response as humans toward injustice is a right thing. Jesus models this a little bit for us when he's angry about the money changers at the temple and the injustice, not just to each individual, but the whole nation and all who come to worship, that's being done and perpetrated against them by these individuals who are abusing their positions to rip off the people as they come to a place of worship, to worship God. And so we know that God gets angry, and there's moments where we should respond with a righteous indignation, a righteous anger. However, the Bible goes on to say, though, that first of all, anger that's unresolved is a dangerous thing for all of us. We allow that individual who's maybe offended us, who may have forgotten about it or moved on, or they're not thinking about it much anymore, we allow them to basically live rent-free in our head, and it creates a lot of bad both attitudes and behaviors on our behalf. First of all, bitterness is a real risk for us. So someone offends us, we get angry. There's the initial sense of injustice in that moment. But if we harbor that and allow that to perpetuate an attitude of anger that's ongoing, this seeps into the soul and moves from being anger to now becoming bitterness. It begins to take over too many aspects of our thoughts and attitudes and even our actions. And bitterness creates kind of a cynicism. It makes us a little bit more hard-hearted. It may affect us in our attitudes towards other relationships as well. It's a very dangerous place. And that's why Paul says that God is a God of justice, and that if there's vengeance that needs to happen, or if there's harboring of anger that's just anger, that we are to turn that over to God and let God do that, and not to keep it for ourselves. So God is the final judge. He's the final arbiter of justice. And so that we're not to harbor that kind of anger or bitterness or rage, because it's a very dangerous place for us. The other reason for this is that we ourselves have plenty of things in our own life that God justly could have that same kind of anger he had towards David, he could have towards us. The fact that God lets that go for us, he's modeled for us the kind of things that we should do towards one another. Now, so I do think when someone's been greatly harmed, greatly violated by another person, that a sense of personal righteous indignation is right, but we don't want to harbor that. We want to say, okay, look, that's an unjust thing. I'm going to turn that over to God now. That's up to God now. I'm not going to harbor that. God could have harbored great anger and animus towards me. He's let that go. So I'm just going to turn that issue over to God, and then I'm going to let that kind of harboring of anger and bitterness go. I think that's the safest place for us to be. Not saying it's easy, but I do think it's the right attitude, the right heart attitude as believers. It's also the safest thing for us in terms of our ongoing spiritual life and walk with the Lord. God is just. We trust His justice. God is also merciful. We trust in His mercy towards us, that He subsided His anger towards us. And we live with those two ideas constantly in our mind. That's a really good question. It's a battle for a lot of people that have been truly violated. And so may God kind of help us all work through those areas of anger. That's a great question. We'll see you guys this Sunday.